Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll make starts. You're very welcome to today's Irish Studies Research Seminar. We're very fortunate today to have two speakers for the price of one, so to speak, talking on different aspects of the theme of today's seminar, which is Shakespeare in Ireland. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers in the order in which they're going to speak, and then we'll have the presentations, and then we'll have time for questions and conversation afterwards. So we've got an audience online with teams as well as people in the room as well. So hopefully people online can see the slides, and the audio is working perfectly this week, hopefully, and we'll proceed. So our first speaker is going to be Molly Quinn-Leitch, who is currently completing her PhD in the School of Arts, English and Languages here in Queen's. Her PhD is funded by the AHRC Northern Bridge Consortium, and it's on the subject of a cultural history of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland. And Molly's going to speak to us today on the themes of her dissertation, specifically a cultural history of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland, materiality, performance, fiction and film. And then connecting with the film theme, our second speaker, Dr. Emer McHugh, is going to follow. Emer is a Mary Sklodowska-Curie Research Fellow in the School of AEL here in Queen's. Her monograph is forthcoming next year on Irish Shakespeare's gender, sexuality and performance in the 21st century. And the paper she's going to give to us this afternoon will be forthcoming very soon. She has the proofs ready for correction as a chapter in a book entitled Shakespeare / Play, edited by Emer. And Emer's going to speak today on who is a great Shakespearean, Kenneth, Branagh, Irishness and the Shakespeare industry. So I'm going to ask Molly to kick off, and then we'll
Yes. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you to Professor Peter Gray for inviting me to speak today. So yes, my paper today will primarily present work on two of my thesis chapters, Shakespeare iconography in Victorian Belfast and professional performance of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland. I also briefly discuss elements of my future thesis chapters. So exploring aesthetic and political dimensions, my paper today and my thesis as a whole demonstrate that Shakespeare's plays, their mobilisation and reception have shaped the material, literary and theatrical fabric of Northern Ireland. Tracing connections between the fragile state and a global literary icon, my thesis makes a case for Shakespeare's applicability and utility in a conflict and post-conflict situation. So to give a brief overview of the first chapter of my thesis, it investigates the relationship between material adaptations of Shakespeare's own likeness and Victorian Belfast specifically. The 6 material manifestations of Shakespeare's person within Belfast are busts and stained glass portraits which reflect an integral set of ideas that are emblematic of Victorian Belfast's rapidly changing sense of self. This chapter considers material commemorations of Shakespeare, which have not until now been critically analysed in any depth. The overarching argument of this chapter is that material adaptations of Shakespeare are linked to Victorian Belfast's civic identity, and that Shakespeare's material commemoration marks an intriguing sense of industrial imperial cohesion in the new city. In introducing a body of material afterlives, this chapter addresses the nuances of Shakespeare's presence within an imperial city on the island of Ireland. I argue by using case studies in my thesis chapter that the presence of Shakespeare helped to build the civic image of Victorian Belfast, which was granted city status by Royal Charter in 1888. So it is important to note that all Shakespeare material traces extant in Belfast today are Victorian. No new traces were planned, built or commissioned after 1901, although some have subsequently been restored, such as the Shakespeare window in the Grand Opera House. In and around Belfast are 6 material commemorations of Shakespeare, 4 stained glass windows and 2 busts capturing Shakespeare's likeness. The 4 Shakespeare stained glass windows extant in Victorian Belfast are found inside the Grand Opera House, the Shakespeare House, Linen Hall Library and Craigavon House off the Circular Road. The 2 busts or faces of Shakespeare are located on a linen mill, which is called Jennymount Mill, and a linen warehouse on 10 Donegal Square South in the centre of Belfast. The fact that busts, faces, and stained glass windows were each conceived during the Victorian period uncovers an intrinsic connection between the playwright and the development of Belfast as a new city and its civic identity during a significant period of change. The physical presence of the playwright constructs a sense of Englishness and of the colonial dominance that the British Empire wielded at the time Belfast was granted city status. I read these material objects as being imperial markers on the buildings of Belfast as they consolidate the city's status as a British power in line with other global commemorations of the playwright at this time. So to briefly contextualise these objects I analysed in detail within my chapter, it is necessary to address the history and particularity of Victorian Belfast as a transitional British city on the island of Ireland. Dermot A. Finnegan and Jonathan Jeffrey Wright explain that the Protestant populace, quote, dominated the town throughout the century, both demographically and politically, and positively identified with Britain rather than Ireland in economic, cultural, and religious affairs. Partly because of this, Catholics in Victorian Belfast, quote, remained disconnected from the socio-political and cultural transformation of this British Protestant city. This leads to the material presence and commemoration of Protestant national figures, such as Shakespeare, for example, reinforcing the Britishness of Victorian Belfast identity, which further disconnects Irish Catholics from the city's built environment. Additionally, as the rest predominantly agrarian Ireland deindustrialised, Victorian Belfast rapidly industrialised. Belfast is the only city on the island of Ireland, quote, to experience the Industrial Revolution while other Irish cities declined, and was coined as Linenopolis due to its position at the epicentre of the world's linen trade. It is within this period of industrialisation and movement that commemorations of Shakespeare were conceived and built. Shakespeare's material presence as an instrument of empire is linked to the transition of Belfast from an Irish merchant town into a British industrial city. Shakespeare's position in and on industrial architecture is linked to Belfast's focus on work ethic, self-improvement, and the city's transformation into an economically booming Linenopolis. My thesis chapter then focuses on the place of Shakespeare in Victorian Belfast and how his material reproductions were likely to be consumed and how the playwright was received in the city. For example, the stained glass window in the Grand Opera House, designed by English theatre architect Frank McHugh, is in a frontal position in the sketch architectural plan, as you can see on the screen. And it is built amidst Belfast Theatre Centre on the Great Victoria Street. This original design feature focalises Shakespeare's hegemony within art and drama, the text of which is engraved on the facade of the Grand Opera House and aligns horizontally with the Shakespeare window. The construction of the Grand Opera House and Shakespeare window corresponded with a renewed spirit of civic pride as an impressive cityscape was emerging in response to Belfast's new status as an emerging city. Victorian Belfast had a significant history of performing Shakespeare, particularly at the Theatre Royal, with its successor, the Grand Opera House, continuing this legacy. In their database, which lists Shakespearean productions in Belfast from 1820 to 1900, the University of Galway records 215 productions stretching back to 1828, when Othello was first performed at the Theatre Royal. By the late 19th century, quote, classics such as Shakespeare became standard in specialised theatre in Belfast. Additionally, Belfast theatre attracted middle class and working class audiences alike. Theatre in Belfast is a space for inhabitants and communities of Belfast, with both middle classes and working classes experiencing Shakespeare's canon and other forms of entertainment on the late Victorian stage. The Shakespeare window pictured here combines the visual tags and evocations of the exotic, continental or eastern, such as palm trees, elephants, and monkeys, which are visible to theatregoers inside the main auditorium, on the ornate ceiling, and also on the exterior of the theatre in oriental onion domes. These adornments reinforce the imperial colouring of Shakespeare memorialisation in Victorian Belfast and illustrates that the theatre conflates the influence of the playwright and the power of the empire in their exotic colonial conquests to elevate the buildings and portraits' theatrical existence in this new British city. By unifying class and Belfast theatres, perhaps the material association between the Shakespeare portrait and allusions to the empire in the Grand Opera House amalgamate to unify a sense of Britishness in the new theatre and across the city. The stained glass portrait of Shakespeare can be read as a marker of imperial dominance and endeavour, as it signifies the alignment of Belfast's built environment within a, quote, British context. The place of the Shakespeare window in the Grand Opera House postulates both a communal experience in Belfast theatre, a communal reception of the playwright, and a communal national identity in this new city. So to summarise the conclusions I've drawn from my first chapter of my thesis, by sketching the connection between Victorian Belfast's extensive transformation and the presence of Shakespeare, material commemorations in its built environment, this chapter marks an unmistakable nuanced sense of industrial imperial cohesion in the new city. My research has illuminated that the development of the city and the 6 material manifestations of Shakespeare possess a concomitant relationship, in that the planning and the constructions of these objects occur at the same time as Victorian Belfast's exponential growth in industry. The material existence of Shakespeare ties Victorian Belfast to the British mainland. Victorian Belfast's new position as an industrialising power in the British Empire is shaped and fortified in the streets, theatres and factories by Shakespeare's materiality. So moving on to work on my second chapter, which focuses on professional performances of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland. The main overarching argument focuses on the fact that Shakespeare performance responds to a moment of unrest, crisis and conflict in Northern Ireland, and how the reception of these plays participate in shaping Northern Ireland's own theatrical heritage. The first professional performance of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland that I could find was The Merchant of Venice, produced by Charles Doran's touring company for the Grand Opera House, Belfast in 1921. Performances in Northern Ireland were also tied to the 1964 and 2016 centenary commemorations to celebrate the legacy of the playwright. The most recent professional performance of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland as of 2024 was Romeo and Juliet, directed by Philip Crawford for the Lyric Theatre, running from the 4th of February to the 5th of March 2023. This confirms the continuing performance history and legacy of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland that is still evolving today. By examining this diverse and dynamic history, professional performances of Shakespeare that hold a place on Northern Ireland stages will also hold an important place in global and Irish Shakespeare discussions. So section 1 of this chapter in my thesis produces an overview of the theatrical history of Northern Ireland from 1921 to the present day to contextualise these Shakespeare performances. This section traces the presence, survival and destruction of Northern Ireland theatres, covering the period immediately following partition, the status and performance during World War II, the destructive and creative impact of the Troubles, and recuperative trends and objectives emerging in post-conflict theatre since the Good Friday Agreement. In the years after partition, although there were, quote, relatively few home-produced shows and plays, Northern Ireland welcomed touring companies to its cities and towns. Companies visited the Grand Opera House in Belfast, the Opera House in Derry, and other regional towns such as theatres and town halls in Enniskillen, Omagh and Armagh, expanding the North's theatrical circle and connections. Touring companies usually originated and travelled over from London, although companies from Dublin, such as the Abbey Theatre and Gate Theatre, also occasionally organised tours. According to Lionel Pilkington's Theatre and the State in 20th Century Ireland, the state of Northern Ireland, quote, was oriented towards maintaining a pro-British allegiance, and professional theatre, quote, continued its long-standing trend of importing most theatre productions from London. So the decline of the actor-manager tradition enabled other playing groups to acquire their own performative spaces. For example, the Lyric Players Group, later the Lyric Players Theatre Trust and the Lyric Theatre, was founded by Mary O'Malley in 1951 and was first located in O'Malley's back garden in Derryvilkie Avenue, Belfast. In his memorial to O'Malley, Bernard Adams writes that she, quote, directed her considerable energy to asserting her own culture in her own theatre and tried to add a, quote, wider Irish dimension to theatre going in Belfast. By establishing a theatre group that was self-producing, O'Malley and the Lyric Players challenged and disrupted the long-standing boundaries of larger professional theatres, especially in Belfast. Additionally, theatre hubs like the, sorry, I just lost my slide here, like the Lyric Theatre were now considered for funding by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, which was founded in 1962. However, the very existence and progress of theatre in Northern Ireland was soon to come under threat by the onset of the Troubles. Imelda Foley suggests, quote, not only artistic license, but the fabric of theatre venues suffered varieties of onslaught. Indeed, many theatres in Northern Ireland were forced to close their doors. In 1971, the Grove Theatre Belfast closed following numerous fires and bomb scares. Even the landmark Grand Opera House could not escape the material consequences of violence and was significantly damaged in May 1993 due to its proximity to the Europa Hotel. Also, the frequency of professional touring company productions diminished, especially in the theatres of Derry and regional towns, with northern venues finding it difficult, quote, to attract touring companies from across the border and from overseas. Despite the material and cultural destruction of Northern Ireland's theatrical fabric, some theatres remained open and were even established during the Troubles. The Riverside Theatre, Coleraine, first opened in 1977 and is now one of Northern Ireland's oldest theatres outside of Belfast. In 1986, Down Theatre opened in the heart of Enniskillen, providing a theatrical hub for the people of Fermanagh. The Lyric Theatre also remained open through much of the conflict, moving into their Ridgeway Street location in 1968. The founder of the Lyric Theatre, Mary O'Malley, was concerned with providing respite for the people of Belfast and, quote, took every opportunity to lift the pervasive gloom. However, not even the Lyric Theatre was free from the bombardment of the Troubles and was, quote, almost obliterated by a 200-pound bomb on the opening night of Patrick Alvin's We Do It for Love in 1975. The Lyric, which remained, quote, almost the only centre of live entertainment remaining in Belfast, had to rebuild in order to survive and readjust in its own ways to the cyclic nature of conflict that dismantled the constancy of theatre in Northern Ireland. So the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 signalled an era of recuperation and healing for Northern Ireland and indeed its theatres. Post-conflict performance is preoccupied with challenging the entrenched narratives of the Troubles and offering new modes of, quote, capturing the complexities, contradictions, and ambivalences of life in post-conflict Northern Ireland. Mark Phelan comments on this transformation in theatre and that a, quote, complex flux of new forces, forms, and themes are shaping contemporary theatre practice in Northern Ireland. New restorative patterns within theatre in Northern Ireland are quickly emerging. So then I move on to section 2 of this chapter, which contemplates on the styleological relationship between the history of post-partition Northern Ireland theatre and the pervasiveness of Shakespeare performance. Through compiling data from databases and performance archives, I have so far listed an estimated 197 productions of Shakespeare since partition to the present day. Of these productions, 93 are comedies, 86 are tragedies, 11 are history plays, and 7 are miscellaneous productions, such as abridged performances of Shakespeare. All is Well That Ends Well, Love's Labour's Lost, Henry V, and the rest of the list there have not been professionally performed in Northern Ireland since partition as of 2024. The timing and location, casting and context reveal how performances of Shakespeare always respond to moments of social and political unrest and upheaval. For example, during the Troubles, the most performed genre was comedy with 36 productions. This statistic suggests that directors and creative practitioners were attempting to present Shakespeare in ways which diffused tension and distracted the audience from the violent political turmoil outside of their theatres. Although the majority of productions take place in Northern Ireland's capital, Belfast, Shakespeare's recorded performances have taken place as far as towns and cities such as Omagh, Enniskillen, Coleraine, Lisburn, to name a few towns and cities. Shakespeare's plays hold an important space and place in theatres, halls, and on stages across Northern Ireland and hold an almost constant presence. Some examples of specific Shakespeare performances throughout the trajectory of Northern Ireland that I examine within my thesis include actor-manager touring company productions of Shakespeare. Although these companies occasionally performed other material, Shakespeare was an essential part of the actor-manager curriculum. The most notable Shakespearean actor-managers who extensively toured Northern Ireland in the first half of the 20th century were Charles Doran, Frank Benson, and Hugh McMaster. Although Benson's company remains solely in a Grand Opera House, as far as I'm aware, Doran travelled to the Opera House, Derry, in 1924, and McMaster visited Enniskillen Town Hall in the 1920s, the 1930s, and again in 1956, and also Omagh Town Hall in 1936 and 1957. In visiting regional towns, actor-manager touring companies presented more technically advanced productions to modest venues and different communities, and disseminated unprecedented performative understandings of Shakespeare outside of Belfast's Opera House. As the actor-manager touring tradition diminished in the 1950s, more original repertory performances of Shakespeare began to emerge. The Lyric Theatre possesses a long history of self-producing Northern Irish Shakespeare plays, with 34 productions, 25 since the players moved into the Ridgeway Street Theatre in 1968, stretching back to 1954 with a performance of Hamlet and Othello, when the players were still an amateur company. Despite the anxieties arising from the violence of the Troubles, Shakespeare still retained a space within theatre programmes. The Lyrics extended Shakespeare's place on their stage during the Troubles with 17 further productions. Shakespeare was a starting point for many local actors at the Lyric, who wished to refine their classical training and advance their professional careers. These local actors included Liam Neeson, Ian McElhinney, Conleth Hill, among others. The success of local actors in the Lyric relatively early in their professional careers suggests that the theatre's consistent engagement with the language, delivery, and staging of Shakespeare provided these actors with the skills needed to propel their careers on a national and international level. So professional touring companies also continued to perform Shakespeare, although this was almost entirely within Belfast. The Royal Shakespeare Company, or the RSC, performed 23 times from 1968 to 1998 and had to adapt to smaller venues in Belfast during the Troubles. These venues included the Whitla Hall, situated on Queen's University campus, and Macefield Leisure Centre in Belfast. And performances were often tied to the Belfast Festival, now known as Belfast International Arts Festival. That being said, the RSC's absence was notable in Derry theatres during the Troubles and beyond. No RSC production of Shakespeare was performed in the city until 2013, when A Rape of Lucrece came to the Waterside Theatre as part of Derry's City of Culture Festival in a politically charged touring performance. Camille O'Sullivan starred in this one-woman cabaret production. Her isolation on the dimly lit stage as you can see from that photo, delineating the isolation felt by SA survivors in a legal and psychological context. The RSC's prolonged absence was most likely due to the complications with theatre company insurance policies being approved during the Troubles. Shakespeare's place and performance throughout Northern Ireland was impacted by forms of cyclic violence. So after the Good Friday Agreement, theatre practitioners found methods to establish a post-conflict conception of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland, and several original productions allude to or confront notions of the statelet's relationship with trauma, identity, and the aftermath of violence. Kenny Gleenan's Titus Andronicus in the Playhouse Derry 2013 was reimagined in contemporary Northern Ireland with a mix of local and professional actors. As of 2023, this has been the only one of Titus Andronicus performed in Northern Ireland, which is likely due to the play's graphic, political, and sexual violence. In the context of post-conflict theatre, Gleenan possesses more authority over the play's central themes, and by placing them within a Northern Irish template, the ultimate device of Titus and Lavinia's dismemberment evokes a contemporary concern for the long-term material and psychological impacts of recurrent and cyclic violence. Certain self-producing productions of Shakespeare are now embedded with healing imperatives, and that audience members can come to terms with their past through performance. So recent performances of Shakespeare have explored the preoccupation with Northern Ireland's mental health and public health system. This can be observed in Zoe Seaton's Macbeth as part of Belfast International Arts Festival in 2020. Seaton's Macbeth is the only entry in my chapter's performance appendix to be performed virtually on Zoom, with the COVID-19 pandemic challenging theatre practitioners to share an increased accessibility of Shakespeare in Northern Ireland. Seaton subverted her audience's Zoom expectations of, quote, joyful and easygoing participation, and used this to, quote, build discomfort in her dark, introspective version of Macbeth with 3 local actors, testing the possibilities of Zoom and virtual theatre. Pascal Abisher comments that the production was, quote, fueled by public mood of suspicion and public health messaging, and a, quote, distrust of politicians that circulated online throughout Northern Ireland during the COVID-19 pandemic. These dramatic choices underline the urgency of this version of Macbeth and introduce the possibilities of virtual or viral Shakespeare to theatre in Northern Ireland, which audience members could share and discuss with the click of a button. Post-conflict and post-COVID-19 pandemic approaches to Shakespeare respond to the precarity of Northern Ireland's social and political future, as well as collective memory of its turbulent past. So moving on to my future chapters, chapter 3 of my thesis discusses community theatre productions, Belfast Tempest and Ard's Midsummer Night's Dream. Both were Terra Nova productions and both were directed by Andrea Montgomery. Shakespeare is constantly returned to in community theatre, which, assisted by peace process funding streams, affirms post-conflict recuperative perspectives. Chapter 4 contends that Shakespeare has exercised a formative influence on Northern Ireland writers. Poets Carson, Heaney, and novelists Lingard, Wilson, and O'Farrell appropriate Shakespeare to negotiate familial, national, and traumatic preoccupations. Chapter 5 uses the Derry Hamlet, directed by Stephen Kavanagh 2005, and Mickey B, directed by Tom McGill 2007, which is filmed in HMP Maghaberry, with prisoners playing most of the roles as filmmaking case studies. These Northern Ireland grassroots productions test the possibilities of film for rehabilitative purposes and expose the precarity of bifurcated subject positions and the use of the Irish language. A sub-argument draws on the Branagh archive in Queen's University Belfast to detail the ways in which Kenneth Branagh has interwoven his Northern Irish roots and Shakespearean career. Via its interdisciplinary imperatives, my PhD project and thesis underscores the unique nature of Northern Ireland's continuing relationship with Shakespeare and a key role the playwright plays in Northern Ireland's still evolving self-imaginings. So yes, that's my paper. So thank you very much for listening. And my pass to Emer. Do you want me to pass this over to you, or do you want to swap seats even? If that's easier. Can I reach?
Is it possible?
Oh no, I don't think.
No.
It's so far, doesn't it?
This is yours. And yeah. Hang on. I'm so useless. I'm trying to remember.
So if you think,
Got it.
yeah, if you can, great.
Perfect.
We like a picture of him.
I know. Okay. It's a great one. Okay, yeah, I think I'm ready to go. Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming along today. Thank you to Peter for inviting me to speak and for putting together this program. Before I get really into the thick of it, I wanted to make a general note about frameworks and methodology. So Molly and I both work in Shakespeare in Ireland studies, and a lot of work in Shakespeare in Ireland studies is a lot of trying to bridge Irish studies, Irish theatre studies, Shakespeare studies, early modern performance studies, theatre and cultural history, it goes on. So, and a lot of it is trying to make these disciplines speak to each other. And it's really great that we're actually having an event like this today, because in the case of Shakespeare in Ireland studies, a lot of things are going on at the same time. Say, you know, specific Irish and or Northern Irish cultural, political, and social contexts. And when I'm speaking to Shakespeare scholars, I literally have to spell out when and what these are all the time, just like kind of like itemizing. This was the like the Eighth Amendment, or this happened in 1993, stuff like that. Whereas if I try doing that here, it's like, yeah, we know, you know. But also as well, the pervasive inheritance of the histories of Shakespeare in early in performance and culture, like across centuries, is hard to deny, even if it's not as overt as you might think it is. And I think this is very important, especially when considering somebody as polarizing as Branagh might be in multiple circles. Some people love him, some people hate him. I just think we need a more nuanced approach to things, you know, rather than just, anyway, this is more gesturing towards that, I suppose. So I ask you to bear that in mind, that we're having to work across different methodologies all the time. And I would also love to talk to you more generally about that in our discussion, because I really feel that we just need to kind of be in conversation with each other a lot more than we are at present. Okay, so yeah, that's my little pricing. Okay, so looking at a book like Stanley Wells's Great Shakespeare Actors, the narrative reads predominantly like a greatest hits of white, British and American actors from Burbage to Branagh. Ira Aldridge is the only non-white actor, and Tommaso Salvini is the only non-Anglophone. So whereas Wells acknowledges that this is his so-called personal selection of actors, his use of what he calls genius, a quality that we may recognize more easily than we may define, as one of his criteria for greatness, gives me pause. As Michael Pickering and Keith Nagos have shown in the context of popular music, and I find it quite telling that I had to turn to popular music studies to help me unpick this, so-called creative exceptionality deserves critical attention. They call for a more nuanced exploration of judging genius. We cannot separate the exceptional from ordinary social and cultural life, since such life constitutes the set of circumstances from which it takes its bearing. To see it as separated as psychological quiddity, mystical visitation, moment of divine inspiration, madness, or drug-induced insight is to see only monumental greatness as they're really abstracted from its contingent temporal and spatial settings. So returning to Wells, he's highlighting of what he calls an extra dimension to great acting which transcends and can even defy technique, an exercise in imagination, an ability to see beneath the surface of Shakespeare's language, to encompass and weld together the diverse elements of a role, the ability to project this understanding in performance after performance, and often in a wide variety of physical circumstances, like imagine trying to use as a criteria for assessment. Projects onto his like chosen actors that mystical quality that Pickering and Nagos critique, when really the selection of these actors by Wells is largely down to a few things: subjective taste, access to specific British companies and repertoires, as well as concomitant mindsets and access to infrastructural resources and archives, which are themselves hedged about with histories. So what is most significant here are the lingering effects of British imperialism and cultural hegemony that pervade how Shakespearean theatrical and cultural histories have tended to be written. As I've already mentioned, most of these mostly white actors are or have been feted for their work in British theatrical institutions. My argument is that a narrative of great Shakespeareans, quite like the one that Wells propagates, has been simplified over time by these effects. I could gesture to several examples of work across global Shakespeare's, pre-modern critical race studies, early modern performance studies, post-colonial studies, and my own field of Shakespeare in Ireland studies that show that British imperialism and cultural hegemony has always pervaded the Shakespeare industry, far beyond what I'm going to talk about today. I am guided by Ayanna Thompson's concept of protein wake work and its implications for theatre history, Blank Atlantic studies, and periodization. Here, Thompson applies protein metaphors and the long cultural history of these metaphors, specifically its harnessing by theatre critics to praise white actors' so-called shape-shifting performances of race, to Christina Sharp's theory of wake work. So wake work is the undisciplined method that Sharp uses to, and this is Sharp's words now, to attend to physical, social, and figurative death, and also to the largeness that is Black life insisted from death, requiring a turn away from existing disciplinary solutions to Blackness's ongoing abjection that extend the dysgraphia of the wake, end quote. And just for context, Sharp is explicitly addressing Black academics working in Black studies here, working and as she says, living in the wake of slavery. So Thompson draws on Sharp's definition of wake work as the endeavor in, and I quote, trying to articulate a method of encountering a past that is not past, end quote. To me, Thompson's thinking theoretically and methodologically about periodization, historicity, evidence, archives, and the stories and histories we allow ourselves to tell as teacher scholars is a rallying cry against flattened, simplified narratives and historiographies of theatre history. As she warns, our histories and stories have been fractured by periodization and its inherent belief in the fractured nature of truth. Is it possible to realign our scholarship with the type of mobility and mutability that Proteus symbolizes? What would it mean if we trained ourselves and our students to approach the past, present, and future with a protein ethos of mobility and connection as a guiding frame? So whereas she's writing specifically in the context of how Black Atlantic studies, early modern studies, and transatlantic theatre history can speak to one another, Thompson's idea of a protein, as she says, mobilizing mutability, theoretically and methodologically, resists Wells' narrative of Great Shakespeareans. So in this paper, I used the case study of Kenneth Branagh, perhaps the most renowned Shakespearean of his generation. Now, I don't think folks here need a very detailed biography, but here are the core details. So began his career in television and West End theatre after graduating from RADA, joined the Royal Shakespeare Company at the age of 23. And I think as to this day, he is still the youngest actor ever to play Henry V at the theatre, or, you know. He also went on to found the Renaissance Theatre Company with David Parfit before subsequently making a name for himself as a director of Shakespeare on stage and screen, having directed himself in Henry V, Much Ado About Nothing, Hamlet, and King Lear, among others. So Wells notes what he considers to be the, and I quote, the rather silly suggestions that Branagh was seeing himself as a second Laurence Olivier, and Olivier, as we know, is that other great Shakespearean. But the comparisons between Branagh and Olivier remain persistent throughout his career. And to the point where he played Olivier in My Week with Marilyn in 2011, I think. Branagh himself seemingly, in the 80s, seemingly resented those comparisons, remarking to GQ in 1989 that then artistic director of the RSC, Terry Hands, was asked what I thought I would do next. And he said it depended on what chapter I was up to in Olivier's biography. I thought, fuck it. And that same year, Michael Billington observed in Interview magazine that Branagh has been crucifyingly dubbed the new Olivier. In fact, he makes Olivier look like a bit of a slouch. But as you can see here, that quote is reproduced on the back of Branagh's memoir, Beginning. So seemingly Olivier comparisons might also help shift a few copies, so swings and roundabouts. Branagh, as many of us here know, is also an Irish Protestant from Belfast who left the north of Ireland at the height of the Troubles. So this is the crux of the paper. And upon the release of Oliver Parker's Othello in 1996, in which Branagh played Iago opposite Lawrence Fishburne in the title role, Fishburne recounted in Premiere magazine a conversation between the two actors. Despite Kenneth Branagh's vast experience with Shakespeare, Fishburne found that he and the Irish actor had a great deal in common. He said to me, "I'm a kid from the streets of Belfast. I'm not supposed to be able to do this." It was like looking in a mirror, because I'm a boy from the streets of Brooklyn. I'm not supposed to be doing this either. So I just want to like focus on what Branagh's comments. So there's a dichotomy that's been raised here, between Shakespeare and Irishness, like a seeming incompatibility between the two. One only need to recall W.B. Yeats's famous declaration that, and I quote, "I owe my soul to Shakespeare, to Spenser, and to Blake, perhaps to William Morris, and to the English language which I think, speak, and write, that everything I love has come to me through English. My hatred touches me with love, my love with hate," end quote. So this is not unique to Branagh, obviously, but it is also a sentiment found and problematized across the histories of Irish Shakespeare performance, adaptation, and reappropriation. Class is also presented here as a barrier to appreciating Shakespeare, as Andy Murphy has found in his exploration of Shakespeare and working class readers. And I quote, "Rather than being a writer to be informally discovered, read, and cherished, as was the case for most of the 19th century, Shakespeare became an author who needed to be studied, and studied in the company of properly professional commentators and interpreters," end quote. For the sake of scope, however, I want to focus on Irishness today. Branagh's Irishness has been rendered invisible, I suggest, through his actor training and through being entrenched and enmeshed in English and Shakespearean theatrical and cinematic traditions. As Ian Dalton and Ida Milne have shown, Irish Southern Protestants figured hugely among the Home Rule and nationalist political classes. Yet Dalton and Milne also draw on Edna Longley's 1989 comment to the Irish Times in suggesting, and I quote, that if Catholics were born Irish, Protestants had to work their passage to Irishness, end quote. So I argue that Branagh, even though he has famously said, "I feel Irish, I don't think he can take Belfast out of the boy," has been working this passage to Irishness throughout his career. And partitionist approaches to Irishness, as well as to Shakespeare in Ireland studies, serve to limit our understanding of what Shakespeare acting and performance is or can be. In reappraising Branagh through the lens of Irishness, I argue for complicating the great Shakespearean narrative, ultimately suggesting that Anglo-Irish cultural exchange plays a significant role in the history of British Shakespeare performance. Okay. So Irish people are notorious for being territorial about their cultural exports, particularly if Sky News are reporting on so-called British success with Oscar nominations. But this recognisable Irishness often becomes essentialised. Other aspects such as whiteness, gender, cis privilege, sexuality, and class also play into essentialising so-called recognisable Irishness in different ways. For example, would Irish people be so quick to claim Danny Day-Lewis if he didn't own a house in County Wicklow or wasn't able to claim Irish citizenship? In addition, Justine Nakase sees Rufenega's casting as Hamlet in the Gate Theatre's 2018 production as, and I quote, "a bold move by the Gate to so clearly highlight an Irish actress of colour in a theatrical ecology and national brand that continues to be overwhelmingly white, despite the country's increasing diversity," end quote. And Justine and myself are also completing a joint written article on Rufenega's Shakespeare work on Broadway, which will be out in Shakespeare Bulletin later this year. So in the north of Ireland, Kenneth Branagh is the Belfast Sun made good, and has endeavoured to cultivate links with local arts, education, and cultural institutions from the early days of his career to the present. And one can see this, without being cynical, as a strategic initiative to affirm and continue that scripted identity conferred on him by the North. For example, he's donated his personal archive to Queen's, an archive of material that this work obviously benefits from. He's also the patron of Ulster Youth Theatre. And it is also Belfast, his 2021 auto-fictional love letter to his home city, for which he won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. Writing in the introduction to the illustrated script, Branagh observes that, "I've often thought in the years since, my life in Belfast was the last time in which I felt I truly knew who I was, where the complete, secure, and settled identity was all-pervading. I knew who I was, where I belonged, and everybody else seemed to know that about themselves and to be equally secure." Yet, outside the North, there's a distinct surprise upon learning that Branagh is from Belfast. Returning to the Othello press tour, Branagh opines to The Independent on Sunday that, and I quote, "some people wouldn't expect me to be anything other than a bland Irishman," end quote. Despite Branagh's seeming self-correction, multiple reviews of Othello from its stateside release prove his instinctive first answer correct. So some examples. British Kenneth Branagh. It is Shakespeare after all. It is Branagh as well. A pair as British as fish and chips. An English lovey Kenneth Branagh. Scanning Google for newspaper articles in the wake of Belfast's release, an interview with Branagh in the Irish Independent begins with the following statement, end quote, though he has quietly pointed it out on numerous occasions, Britain has never quite accepted the fact that Kenneth Branagh is, in a sense, Irish, end quote. So from the interviewer's perspective, Branagh is Irish, but with some reservations, it seems, because he's apparently Irish in a sense. But in what sense or whose sense? And why is there the need to qualify Irishness in such a way in comparison to fellow Northerners such as Liam Neeson or Ciarán Hinds, who are from a Catholic background? In a Free State review, or broadly outside of the island of Ireland, it is as if he is simply not Irish enough. And in the context of Branagh narrating his early years, there's a recurring theme of guilt when it comes to Irishness, and much of this is bound up in the loss of his Belfast accent and the pressure to conform in 1970s writing. Writing in Beginning, he recounts that the early 70s were not a good time to be Irish in Reading. Every death reported on the television news made me try to change even further. I longed just to blend in. After a year or so, I'd managed to become English at school and remain Irish at home. It was a dreadfully uneasy compromise by which I suffered inordinate guilt. For as long as I could, I kept up the double life, but my voice gradually took on a twang of suburbia. Given this forced dichotomy between Englishness in public and Irishness in private, especially during a time when Anglo-Irish relations were especially tense and when anti-Irish sentiment was particularly virulent in England, young Branagh's feelings of guilt are revealing. And so too are his comments about his time studying at RADA. Besides noting that, and I quote, not a trace of Branagh's Belfast accent remains, end quote, a 2019 Irish Times interview upon the release of All Is True, in which Branagh directed himself playing Shakespeare in his late years, also features Branagh reflecting on the inclusion of a received pronunciation exam at RADA. As he said, there was no desire to knock out our accents, but we needed to be able to speak that way if required. However, it seems as if Branagh can still call upon the Belfast accent at will. In 2022, while appearing on the Late Late Show to promote the release of Belfast, then host Ryan Tubridy asked Branagh if his Belfast accent was buried and gone, only to Branagh to prompt audience laughter by speedily switching into a Belfast accent, clarifying that, and I quote, "It is not buried and gone, Ryan. In fact, the first job I had when I came back from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art was in the autumn of 1981. I went back to my granny's and stayed with my Uncle Jim and my Auntie Kathleen and played Billy in the Billy plays for about a month." He said that all in a Belfast accent before switching back. So why focus on the accent at all? Why does this matter? So recent work by Adele Lee and Sonia Masai elucidate the politics of acoustic normativity and accentism in relation to Shakespeare performance, which is crucial to praising Branagh as an Irish Shakespearean. As Masai asserts, accents are especially significant in relation to Shakespeare because of the role that Shakespeare has played as England's national poet in the establishment of the standard English pronunciation since the mid-18th century. Efforts to standardize English pronunciation went hand in hand with the rise of English as the language of empire. In the introduction to Shakespearean accentism, Lee notes how the Irish lilt continues to be associated with the rebellious and the malcontented. Shakespeare, as we know him and his work, is typically an English cultural product, bound up with the legacies and ramifications of empire and cultural imperialism. And in addition, the relationship between Shakespeare and Ireland is thus a very complex, nuanced one, formed by cultural hegemony and imperialism, made up of contradictions, cultural inheritances, and often insecurities. Branagh, in many ways, has long been associated and also subsumed within the apparatus of English Shakespeare for specific purposes. Of course, there is his work with the RSC, as well as the cinematic adaptations and theatrical productions of Shakespeare plays, predominantly featuring what we might call the upper crust of British acting. There's also his performance in the 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony, reciting Caliban's "This Isle is Full of Noises" speech from The Tempest, while dressed as Isambard Kingdom Brunel, as well as his acceptance of a knighthood in 2012. As Lee states, And I quote, Branagh perfected the lingua franca of the establishment despite his Northern Irish roots, end quote. But as Courtney Lehman suggests, and I quote, the heaps of fragments of postmodern cultural production are inextricable from his post-colonial experience of sectarianism, end quote. Put simply, the reality of his Irish identity and heritage is inextricable from appraising his work. And I take my lead from Mark Burnett's suggestion of a nuanced sense, not of a single Shakespeare, but of a plural and malleable cultural identity. Shakespeare's place in Ireland is deeply involved in the contradictory processes and in the shifting power balances that accompany the colonial encounter. Although Shakespeare's work can be seen as an imperial export, it also belongs to a broader dialogue, a system of negotiations, manipulations, and imaginative reinscriptions. Equally significant, of course, in this respect are the multiple Irelands and notions of Irishness, Englishness, and Britishness. And I'm reminded here of Lehman's harnessing of Zizek's theory of ideological quilting in envisioning Shakespeare as, and I quote, the figure who quilts together the loose ends of Branagh's fractured identity, end quote. And so, in line with Burnett's argument, I proffer an approach that resists partitionist thinking to Irishness, that sees Irishness and the border between North and South in a more porous, nuanced fashion. I find Ciara L. Murphy's analysis of terminologies of Irishness across the island of Ireland in performing social change on the island of Ireland instructive for my purposes here. As Murphy writes, Ireland and Northern Ireland are the agreed terms legally. However, this does not always allow space to consider the multitudes of intersecting identities that are framed within and across these spaces. The border is a liminal space, both real and tangible and unreal and untouchable. The fluidity of the designation of Irishness or Northern Irishness or even Britishness does not always follow this arbitrary line. So writing about Irish Shakespeares, whether in performance, on film, at home or abroad, from an all-island approach must incorporate the liminality and fluidity that Murphy writes of here, and must incorporate the plurality and malleability that Burnett writes of as well. Eschewing such partitionist approach to Shakespeare in Ireland also enables a fuller understanding of the significant position that Irish actors occupy in genealogies of Shakespeare performance and acting in a broader sense, particularly with respect to the histories of the British Shakespeare industry. And this incomplete understanding only leads to a flattened, simplistic narrative of theatrical, cinematic, and cultural histories and historiographies. So to conclude, appraising Branagh's Irishness also provides insight into his artistic choices in adapting Shakespeare and into the role that Anglo-Irish cultural exchange plays into the politics of editing, adaptation, and appropriation. So we'll return to Branagh's filmic Henry V, specifically its uses of Captain McMorris. So Courtney Lehman reads John Sessions' performance as McMorris in Henry V as, and I quote, an exaggerated stereotype of the wild Irishman, drunk, belligerent, and distinctly Catholic, in the context of reading Branagh's adaptation as the residue of his attempts to abolish the threat of his Irishness, end quote. So I want to contextualize what I'm going to say with my doubts that it's actually even possible to play such stage stereotypes like the stage Irishman, like McMorris Stephen Straight, unless you, per Nora J. Williams, and I quote, got the Shakespeare play first, end quote. Yet watching this scene, Sessions' portrayal of McMorris reads as somewhat playing it straight, and not as exaggerated comic relief that is more readily associated with the character. And one of his most striking qualities is the softly spoken voice that Sessions uses in the role. As Branagh commented to Ramona Ray and Mark Burnett, McMorris in the earlier RC production that Branagh starred in, and I quote, became quite broad and to my mind not very funny, end quote. So there's this notable contrast then between Branagh's perspective, which he partially attributes to his Irish background and is certainly informed by growing up during the Troubles, that playing McMorris for laughs was, in his words, politically inappropriate and insensitive, which it is, and Greg Doran's 2015 RC production that included McMorris, is right there, who in Peter Curran's words, and I quote, fumbled with grenades and shoved them against his ear to hear as if they were likely to blow up, which is at least the second time I've seen an Irish explosives expert as a funny role on the RC stage, end quote. So now it's 2015. So here I wish to return to Thompson's idea of a mobilizing mutability, which is a complementary bedfellow to Murphy and Burnett's thinking. With respect to the subject at hand, what would it mean to harness the ethos of mobility and connection between British Shakespeare theatrical history, Shakespeare and Ireland studies, Irish studies, and theatre and celebrity culture? Branagh as a major Shakespearean cannot be fully understood without paying heed to how Irishness plays its part, and it cannot be fully understood without employing an unromanticized, non-essentialized, non-Britishness sense of Irishness. It points towards a more comprehensive sense of the rich history of Irish creatives' engagement with Shakespeare. And more broadly speaking, it complicates the great Shakespearean narrative into a richer, more fulsome tapestry of theatre and cultural histories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emer and Molly, for two excellent papers, overlapping in many ways. So we've got time for questions. Obviously, people in the room know how to indicate you want to ask a question. Anyone online wants to ask a question, you can kind of raise your hand electronically or type a question into the comment box, and Luke will alert us to you wanting to ask a question. Yeah, we'll start at the back there.
Yeah, I was asking what the what Shakespeare looked at the arts. Have you looked at the arts theatre and group theatre? Have you looked at schools of performing Shakespeare at that time?
So I haven't looked at schools per se. RC did perform, I think, in some schools in Northern Ireland. And I think a lot of schools were involved in the Grand Opera House performances as well, like a joint kind of between professional and for like a curriculum as well, because Shakespeare was very important to Northern Ireland's curriculum. I've looked at, there is a very important database, the Linen Hall Library. It's called the Digital Theatre Archive. They have a lot of past programmes from the group theatre and the arts theatre. So I have looked into some of those, but within my thesis chapter at the moment, I have 3 case studies, so I don't go into detail in analysing the performances, but in my performance archive, at the minute have a huge list of like every Shakespeare performance I can find. There probably is more that I haven't found yet, but those databases and archives are very important to me, and the arts theatre and the group theatre have come up quite prominently in that. Yes.
Interesting to look at how, you know, Shakespeare's obviously studied at school, so
Yes.
And did any of those kind of, you know,
Yeah.
go on to shoot more kind of actors?
Yeah. My next chapter I'm focusing on is community performance, so I might lean on that kind of importance to curriculum, etc. The complexities of performing Shakespeare in certain schools, in Belfast, etc. During troubles, during conflict as well. So I might lean on that more as well in my next chapter.
And the Royal Shakespeare Company generally took a play that was on the curriculum. So.
Oh yes, yes. Indeed.
Speaking of like curriculum and schools and all that, I think because I was just really interested to hear about different but how many tragedies, how many comedies are performed. It seemed as if they were avoiding the problem plays a lot.
Yes,
you know,
indeed, yeah.
Apart from Measure for Measure, but also, I was actually interested to hear about like how many late plays were performed with, or were they banded in with the tragedies or whatever. But it also speaks to kind of like and this happens in the South as well, where performance is tied in. The genre of the Shakespeare play chosen is always tied in with the curriculum, the schools, and actually you probably really on this, so apologies if you really are. Janet Clare wrote a really interesting article for Shakespeare Survey back. It's like a survey kind of article about performance in Ireland 2004, and she does really interesting analysis of the choice of Shakespeare plays in relation to the junior leaving curriculum. So that might be interesting in terms of like comparisons and all that. But anyway, I will stop for now. So I have lots of thoughts.
Yeah, I was just wondering, would you have encountered any stuff about the impact of partition upon Shakespeare productions in the South, particularly Dublin?
I haven't examined that in great detail. I'm mainly focusing on the North and the impact of I guess, in the north, like a lot of London companies, etc., came over to Belfast and to Enniskillen and Omagh, and then the Gate Theatre and the Abbey Theatre also from Dublin came and performed as well. But I haven't focused that in great detail, I must say. Do you have any insight into that? Or?
God, I mean, brilliant question.
Yeah.
I can't say for certain, but the very first Shakespeare production at the Abbey Theatre was 1928, and that was King Lear, directed by James Johnson, and apparently it wasn't a big hit with the crowds. But like before then, I can only speak for like in the 1900s, that the Abbey had links with Shakespeare practitioners like Frank Benson and William Pole, and like Benson, like obviously like did touring and all that. But in terms of direct, I mean, I think it was also kind of the political project of stuff like the Abbey, where it like, because Yeats is like, oh, I love Shakespeare, but also I'm conflicted about it. Whereas like Sing and Lady Gregory were a bit more like not very, you know, keen on performing it much. So the fact that it took about 24 years after the Abbey was founded for it to be on the Abbey stages. Interesting.
Thanks both, and I've got a number of questions I could ask, but actually, just given the way the conversation's going, I mean, one of the things to point out is that one of the things that Yeats is doing is, you know, insofar as he's aware of himself as an Irish Renaissance figure, he is modelling on the Renaissance.
Oh yeah.
I was interested in the comparative absence of the history plays in production here, because Yeats's Cuchulainn plays are modelled specifically as a kind of Irish equivalent of the Shakespearean histories. And a lot of this is going back to his own arguments with Dowden at Trinity in the 1890s. So there's a sort of undertow to all of this. So, you know, the explicit production of Shakespeare at the Abbey isn't there.
Yeah.
But the implicit production of Shakespeare seems to be more or less constant. You know, I mean, all this going back to the work of Philip Edwards' Special Illumination, for instance.
Yes.
But really, if there is a question in all of this, it's about that comparative absence of the history plays. I mean, it's one of the Richards, I think, the Henriade is almost completely absent from your list.
Yeah, I think Richard III is the most performed in Northern Ireland. But yes, the Henrys, they usually would only play one or two parts, never in full usually.
No.
So
I mean, I think there's a crucial element here, which has been picked up already, is the school curriculum.
Yeah.
In some ways, everything that happens in professional theatre production is secondary to that reality. I mean, there's obvious reasons, I suppose, why Shakespeare features so strongly in the northern GCSE and before that O-level curriculum. Henry IV Part 1 was an O-level text, which is Brad Apple produced. But I can tell you, the only reason for doing a Shakespeare play at the Lyric is for the school's market. You're looking at your programming decisions, and you can say, well, there's a block of money we can get in there if we do the Shakespeare's. And I think it would be pay attention just to go back and look at how that has been expressed over the decades, because I think at the moment there is a more generic requirement that students see a Shakespeare play. For decades, and certainly through the periods of the 80s and the 90s, it was very prescriptive. When we used to go with the Lyric to the curriculum board, we'd say, could you please choose something that we can produce? Because they were putting on plays like King Lear, for instance, which had a cast size which was way beyond anything we could afford to do. And in the Republic, I mean, I think it's a really profound question, why has Shakespeare been such a perennial feature of the Irish curriculum, not significantly in drama, but as a literary text. And it's always been Othello, Merchant of Venice,
Romeo and Juliet,
Macbeth,
Hamlet.
You know, there's choruses plays, and there was a company in Dublin that was set up second age, specifically to produce
still going.
And the problem is they can never break out of that cycle. And I sat on a panel for the Arts Council in Dublin a few years ago, desperately trying to break this stranglehold of those six texts from schools, so we don't buy new books. So the conservatism, but crucially and culturally, why does the Irish educational establishment place Shakespeare at the centre of what it defines as education? You know what I mean? Then everything else really flows from that.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if many Shakespeare productions weren't programmed professionally because of the schools.
Yeah. No, I think I think that question you ask is it's something that I think about a lot, and it's just like so much. Again, like as with Shakespearean art studies, there's so much going on at the same time. Like even like, but it's also a lot of tension as well between that need to be like, this is our own kind of education system, but we have to have a bit of Shakespeare. But I do think it warrants more of an exploration for sure. And also, on that note, Deirdre Finucane at the Shakespeare Institute in Birmingham, Stratford-upon-Avon, is writing her PhD on adaptations of the history plays in an Irish context, which would be great. And in terms of the Yeats and the history plays, I mean, like, there's like at Stratford-on-Avon where he goes to see Frank Benson doing the history cycles and all that. And of course, there's Druid Shakespeare from 2015, which is interesting because it amalgamated the plays into like a 7-hour. I mean, it could be broken up into 2 parts. Well, technically 4, but it was also like it was the first kind of adaptation of the histories, like those history plays together, like in such a long time in an Irish context. But it was but also in the South anyway.
Question for Molly. You started with the idea that Shakespeare is an instrument for creating a British identity for Belfast and raising an Irish identity. Now, one of your exhibits is what's now 10 Square.
Yes.
But if you look at those, there's a whole series of busts.
There is,
they're very cosmopolitan. There's Michelangelo, there's Columbus, there's Schiller, and there's Thomas More.
Yes.
So that's hardly consistent with erasing Irish identity, is it?
I wouldn't go so far as saying that it erases Irish identity, but what my thesis focuses on the connection between. So 10 Square was an old linen warehouse in the Victorian period. So was Jenny Mount Mill, and the Linen Hall Library today was an old linen warehouse as well. So I focus on the connection between the industry and the industrialization of Belfast during that time, and the connection between Shakespeare as an imperial figure and Belfast. Belfast attempting. My argument focuses on Belfast using these material strategies to forge that imperial identity by using Shakespeare's likeness. But yes, again, there's Schiller, there's Minerva. We can't for certain say the actual architects of that of 10 Square. We don't know them. They're unknown architects. We can't for certain say their strategies. But my thesis and my chapter attempts to answer this. It's an incredibly interesting connection, and it's one that is, from my view, unique to Belfast in terms of Shakespeare doesn't appear on factories, for example, in England. It seems to be specifically in Belfast. So to me, that's a very interesting connection, and to that's one I focus on within my chapter.
But don't forget, it's the Joffrey brothers. So these are emigres from Hamburg. So that's a whole further layer of identity politics there.
Yes, thank you.
I was just going to follow up on that. The half dozen places that you were mentioning, I mean, they're independent, they've been built by merchants and entrepreneurs, or they're at least arm's length if you're looking at something like the Opera House. And the only thing that you made me think that, but the things I think of where there is actual municipal approval, the kind of Shakespearean reference would be the Oberon at Tyne Street.
Yes, very good, yes.
But what you're looking at, those 6 examples that you're using, those seem to be coming from, the industrialists, rather than the council.
Yes. Yeah, I actually mentioned Oberon and Titania Street in my thesis as well, because I guess street names are material as well. But yes, that's, as you say, a municipal government kind of agreement there for the street names. But yeah, there is an undeniable link with Shakespeare and industry and empire, and it hasn't been looked at in any great detail. The materiality of Shakespeare, like why is he in Belfast? Why is he specifically made in Victorian Belfast? And to me, that is interesting. That is what that chapter leans on. So yeah.
And I think your work also, it kind of is part of that really great strong scholarship that links between Shakespeare and Victorian cultural and theatrical history, like with Sally Barndon and Sophie Duncan and Stuart Fullers and all of them. So it's kind of like bringing Belfast into conversation with those wider conversations.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Vaguely for resolve the last two, props to Emer. I was quite taken by the quotation from Branagh, something I come from the streets of Belfast, and another actor making the same point in relation to the streets of Brooklyn.
Yes.
But it struck me, wouldn't a more obvious interpretation of that be a reference to their respective social backgrounds? And in a way, possibly, I'm just putting this out, isn't there a lack of emphasis on social class all through perhaps what both of you have been saying? Now, I know identity politics are fashionable at the moment, but that may well be a time-bound focus of analysis.
Oh yeah. No, I agree. Like, no, actually, there wasn't much room for me to kind of talk about class, and I think there's still lots of, I think class, especially with Branagh, class is extremely important because, say, if I just pull up something, if I could, there is that kind of presumption that Branagh is from an upper class background, calling him a lovey, kind of like he's like very, actually there's, I didn't have room for this in my paper, but I'd found this this tweet about this tweet that kind of pokes fun at him, kind of talking about like it's about when Artemis Fowl was being released in 2020, and imagines like a conversation between Disney saying, "Oh, we need an Irish director to do Artemis Fowl," and it says, and then it's imagined like Branagh being like, "Oh, why not take a punt on old K-Bone? I'm like I'm as Irish as the cricket grounds in Queen's University," and it's very, like stuff like that. And so you have this again, like why not take a punt on old K-Bone? So it's kind of like saying, oh, he doesn't even have a British like an actual Irish accent, and also equivocating cricket and Queens and all that, with Protestantism. But also it does imply that this is not like, I mean, obviously he has a very comfortable status now, like, but I think the fact that he's from from a working class Belfast background does get forgotten quite a lot. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it is something I need to dig more into.
Hi, yeah, just a few two early ones. That's all right. I found your point on Titus Andronicus to be really riveting there, Molly, and added a whole new dimension to it. And I just love that crazy ass play anyway.
Yeah, so, it's crazy.
It's great fun.
It is.
Yeah. But I wonder on the flip side, in terms of the healing prerogative, what the sort of performance history of The Winter's Tale has been post 1998.
Yeah. I don't think The Winter's Tale, off my head, I think it's been only performed one or two times in Northern Ireland. Again, not a very popular play, which is interesting,
it's
isn't
really
it?
not.
So yeah.
Difficult one. Did come with the festival there.
Yes.
Propeller brought a production of it. Yeah.
Yes. So it has been performed, but specifically post-conflict theatre, I guess, as you would say, it hasn't been performed as much. So there is that performative gap there, and it's interesting to see what theatre practitioners will bring to Northern Ireland, and if that might feature soon. Because again, if we're going back to curriculum, The Winter's Tale really isn't featured that highly in the curriculum. So again, maybe it ties into that as well. But yes, it would be interesting to see a Winter's Tale performance here soon.
I
So
think
yeah.
it wasn't A-level text.
Yeah.
Oh,
in the age of the 90s.
Oh, there we go.
It was again, it was one of those
Ah,
things that was
fascinating.
very introduced.
Uh-huh.
I just,
That's interesting.
I just love hearing that history. Actually,
Yeah.
Sarah Olive might be, Sarah Olive has done a lot of work on like Shakespeare and English education. So Shakespeare Valued is the book as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, I just find that history of like which plays are, you know.
There's something
Yeah.
I think that maybe draws the two papers together, and it's to do. I hesitate to sort of enter this territory, but it's to do with the search for some kind of distinct Northern Protestant identity that is often linked to a wider European kind of identity. So, for instance, I remember the first director of the Ardome Theatre in Enniskillen always saying that he could attract Protestant audiences to the Ulster Orchestra playing Beethoven and Mozart, but he would attract a predominantly nationalist audience, you know, for O'Casey or whatever, you know, that there was this sense of wanting to have a more blurred identity which would be on the immediate confines of the six counties.
Yeah.
And there is this thing which I think a lot of people recognise, is that Northern Protestants only become Irish when they go to England.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
they don't think of themselves as Irish, but once they're there, they're Paddy's like everybody else.
Oh.
I do think that's caught up in how Branagh has defined himself, that he had his Irishness imposed on him in Reading.
But also, yeah, very true. But also, I decided to have we look at because at say for example Sky News, just looking up like the Oscars, whatever, and Branagh always gets referred to as Sir Kenneth Branagh, Sir Kenneth, da 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 da. But yeah, you know, but I think your point still stands up. You know, again, like having it imposed and just actually.
I think he ran with it, obviously, but I mean, I think strong commercial reasons for doing that.
Yeah, no, actually, just yeah, that's made to note of that. Thank you.
Look, we've got online questions.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The back, yeah.
Do you think that Shakespeare could be performed successfully in Belfast accent?
Of course.
Do you think it
So,
could?
what was the questions? I didn't quite hear them.
If Shakespeare can be performed successfully in a Belfast accent.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Rough Magic does. Like, you know, and actually, again, actually,
Northern broadside, so.
yeah, Northern Broadside, you know.
See, I think it was something good enough to Scots accent.
Sorry?
I think it was something good enough to Scots accent, because also Scots accent is slower, more nuanced. Belfast accent can be very harsh, very quick for an audience.
I mean, I think that's why I work like on accentism and accents by, you know, as I was saying, like Adele Leahy, that she's formerly of this parish, and Sonny Mathai, in terms of like accent normativity is really, really important. And then also just thinking about, like, I go back to Abigail Brooks and Woodall's work on Shakespearean verse speaking, and how like there's this standard of Shakespearean verse speaking that's been established in English Shakespearean institutions like the RSC, the National Theatre, and so on and so forth, and how it kind of just, and how she traces the history of how this so-called standard has been normalized. And then there's some, and then what's so great about working in Shakespeare and Ireland studies is exploring how these histories are in dialogue with those so-called standards that have been imposed. If that makes sense. Say, I mean, this is from the South, but Druid Shakespeare is a really interesting case study, because Aisling O'Sullivan, who played Henry V, deliberately chose this very guttural, harsh County Kerry accent as Henry V, and it was just a very deliberately, like, you know, unheroic kind of interpretation. I mean, I've written about it if anyone's interested in reading more about it, but you know, it's just, I think what's so interesting about this field of work, like what Molly's doing as well, is seeing how this is in dialogue, like this history is in dialogue with these histories next door, so to say. Yeah, and there's a lot of really exciting work, actually, because actually what I want to say to you also is, because you draw upon Pilkington in terms of like the history of like importing theatre, but also is thinking about how Madeleine Seidenberg is doing some really exciting work on what she calls circumnational 18th century Irish Shakespeare performance, in terms of like that movement between Dublin and London. And then that comes on from like what Chris Morash's work, and how there's no kind of stable sense of a national theatre, you know, like there's that kind of just that history of mobility. And I'm just doing hand gestures now, but yeah, so much there.
I'm double dipping, excuse me.
Yes.
So one of my favorite, like most ridiculous historical episodes to do with Shakespeare is like the Astor Place riots that took place in Manhattan, where like people died because of these two warring theatrical companies who were fighting over a single stage. It's just completely crazy. So I'm wondering if there's any like analog here in terms of like social resistance to Shakespeare productions at all?
Thinking of an example, I can't think of any really specific, but I knew McMaster, so he was an actor touring manager in the 1920s until his death in the 1950s. And when he first came to Enniskillen for Fermanagh for the first time, there was a bit of social resistance there. My sources come from papers, so that's the only newspaper sources. So from reviewers and newspaper articles. But yes, there was a bit of resistance to him performing Shakespeare, and also a London company coming to Enniskillen and performing Shakespeare. Obviously, I think it was in the article. It was kind of hinted at being maybe a community, a divide in the community against performing Shakespeare, and also class as well. That was kind of intimated in the article. So maybe, but then he gradually kind of broke down those barriers at New McMaster, and he continuously returned to Enniskillen, and that kind of shows his enduring popularity in the community. And I feel like New McMaster was definitely one of the most important figures in presenting Shakespeare to regional towns in Northern Ireland outside Belfast, because as my performance appendix has shown, performances in Northern Ireland in the 1920s, 30s and 40s and 50s were mainly in Belfast. So he definitely kind of paved the way, in my view, in exposing communities to Shakespeare.
And was he an Enniskillen local?
So his identity is he was a pseudo-Irishman as well, I think. So
Harold Pinter worked with them.
Yes, he did, yeah. I think he'd heard with him as well, Thomas.
He wrote an essay.
So yes, he put on an Irish identity, but he was actually from, I can't remember, somewhere in England. But he was good friends with McHugh.
McLemore.
Yes, as well. He's another pseudo-Irishman. Yes.
Yeah.
Anti-Branagh.
Yes, indeed. Anti-Branagh. That's what there's a terminology.
Oh my god. The one I can think of is, and it's something I've been working on for the last while. Well, I've been shifting between. Is a disruption of Fiona Shaw directed an adaptation of Hamlet in the early 90s, which toured around the island, called the Hamlet Project. Don't know why she called it the Hamlet Project, still figuring that out. And it was disrupted in Cork by an anti-choice school teacher. I say that because she ran for the Dáil on that platform the year before, and she didn't win a big share of the vote, and she took a lot of umbrage because there was a naked Hamlet in it, and there was also Hamlet was naked at one point, and also there was also one point where Polonius was simulating a sex act on Rinaldo, and then she just got very angry and stormed the stage and was like, "There's no homosexuality in Shakespeare. This is not Shakespeare. I want my money back." She did get her money back. And so in terms of other things, I don't know. That's the one that that's the only one I can think of. And
Last question. At this point. I'm leaving this to you because it is a vast area. I'm talking mostly about professional theatre. But one of the other major indices of Shakespeare popularity here would be the drama circuit, which is was huge.
Yeah.
And they get, local companies get to choose their own plays.
Yes.
All of that. I wondered if either of you had touched on that at all.
I haven't. I mean, I actually was going to say to you anyway that actually, in terms of Vinnie O'Gorman, who mainly specialises in Irish theatre studies, does amazing work on the histories of Irish amateur theatre. So he would have more insight into that. I mean, Michael Dobson has written about this is centuries ago, but the Kilkenny players wrote about that. But in terms of more modern stuff, Finian has done a lot more work on that.
Yeah. I've touched on it a little bit, I think, in my next chapter on community. Obviously, the Turnover Productions, so they're semi-professional companies, so they do use amateur and professional actors, but they're all about integrating the community, etc., through performance. And they performed in 2016 centenary as well. I do touch a bit on as well. There used in Belfast in post-partition, there was a Belfast British Empire Belfast Society, which was an amateur company, well, not a company, they were a group, and they met and had monthly meetings, and they read Shakespeare together, and they kind of again spread awareness of Shakespeare and the imperial connections of Shakespeare, etc. And I think it diminished in the 1950s, but again, there's that kind of communal understanding of Shakespeare in Belfast that was kind of initiated by them. And I think there was a lot of actor touring managers at the time, Frank Benson, etc. They came and they actually gave lectures and read with Shakespeare with them. So in terms of specific amateur productions, I haven't touched a lot on that, but I'm definitely thinking at the minute about community and what Shakespeare means and how the relationship between community and Shakespeare has built and transformed since partition, I suppose. So yeah.
Right.
Rather appropriately, there's a lovely chapter in one of our produced books on reading Shakespeare in 22 University Square.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's really nice.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and participating. Can I ask you to thank Molly and Emer for sharing with And just before everyone goes, we do have one more seminar before we break up the Easter vacation. So next Monday, 11th of March at 4:30, is Dr. Pauline Colombier from the University of Strasbourg in France coming to speak on women and home rule, insights from fictional and non-fictional sources. And that will be looking particularly at the subject of Pauline's most recent book, which is about home rule fictions, and particularly utopian home rule fictions, visions of the future coming out of the home rule movement in the late 19th, early 20th century. So thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.